Chapter 15. The Killers. The Ranganese hesitated in the doorway of the Matsuda compound, regarding Misaki with expressions that ranged from apprehensive to amused. Had she been a man or even a more imposing woman, they surely would have attacked by now, but they hung back, seemingly confused to find a tiny housewife standing before them. The hallway was too narrow to accommodate all four of them shoulder to shoulder. Someone had to make the first move. Her victim stepped forward, unknowingly sealing his fate. He looked to be nearing middle age, in his late 30s or early 40s, yet he still wore the colors of a low-ranking soldier. He must not have been particularly skilled or powerful to have gone so long without a promotion. One look into his face and Misaki could see through him to the internal mechanisms that moved him. This man was insecure, looking for an easy way to feel powerful, like picking on a defenseless housewife. Robin would have seen the humanity in that kind of cruelty, even if it was turned on him. He would have seen a way to make this man better. Misaki saw only eye sockets, a throat, a sensitive groin, 100 points of attack to choose from. Instead of drawing her shoulders back as the Fanyaka approached, she cowered, like dropping bait in the water before a clueless fish. He smiled, the smile of a weak man seeing a very rare chance to feel powerful. "Don't hurt me," she whimpered in Shirajima dialect. She knew how to say the words in Ranganese, but why let on that she knew their language? Why let them see any of her before it was too late? "Please, don't hurt me." Drawn to her lure, the man closed the distance between them with hunger in his eyes. Misaki waited until he was almost on top of her, then opted for the simplest point of attack. Why waste her best material on this idiot? She snapped a kick into his groin. With a high grunt, the Fanyaka doubled over. The kick was by no means incapacitating, but it bought her the moment she needed to gather ice to her fingertips. And before the man could straighten up, she had him by the throat. Misaki's hands were so delicate that her grip was not particularly dangerous in and of itself. That was why she had invested so much time and training in her claws. It was these men or her children. Robin would forgive her. 5 nails of ice pierced deep into the man's neck. His eyes widened in shock. He opened his mouth as if to scream, and blood bubbled from between his lips, dribbling down his chin. Curling her fingers in as far in as they would go, Misaki ripped her hand free. His windpipe shredded in her fingers. Like that, she was a killer. The remaining men let out cries of alarm as their comrade fell, but Misaki didn't give them time to take stock of the situation. Before the body had thudded to the floor, she was moving, sprinting on bare feet toward the next nearest soldier. She picked up speed and focused on her target's face, reading his expression. He fell for it. He thought she was stupid enough to charge him. Looking confident, he drew his arm back and threw a palm strike. Just before the burst of phonia left his hand, Misaki veered right, running up the wall. In the end, Misaki never did find out if her legs had the strength to carry her to the end of her old maneuver. The peripheral wind off the blast pushed her body, flipping her over onto her feet directly behind the Fanyaka. Realizing his mistake, the soldier started to turn, but it was too late. Siradenya was out of her sheath. A single stroke severed his spinal cord. In the same spin, Misaki turned and cut through the next soldier. Only a few steps behind his comrade, he probably didn't even see what had happened before Shadow's daughter separated his torso from his legs. One more to go. Misaki made her cut, but this last soldier was a young man fast, and he stepped back, out of range. Wary eyes flicked over her, taking in her stature, her weapon, her stance, sizing her up. She couldn't allow that, so she pressed in, black blade flashing in a second attack, meant to drive him up against the wall and into a corner. Infuriatingly, he evaded again, backing through the genkan and partway out the door, drawing his own inferior sword. Smart boy. The aggressive part of Misaki itched to follow him, but she knew that if she let him take the fight outside, onto open ground, she was a dead woman. So instead, she darted right, through the nearest side hallway, disappearing as was her way. The windowless hallway was so dark it might have been one of Livingston's alleys, and it was going to stay that way. Misaki formed a block of solid ice over the light switch. As she went, She slid all the doors open, coating the door frames in ice. Then she flattened herself against the wall, melting into the shadows, and waited. The soldier moved down the hallway on cautious feet. If he was smart, he was listening closely, his hands open, trying to detect her breath stirring the air. But Misaki could hold her breath for a long time. This was where the dark put a Fanyaka at a serious disadvantage. Despite their acute hearing, Fanyakala had no sense of a person's heat signature or blood flow, making them blind to a stealthy enough opponent. Misaki, on the other hand, could feel every inch of her prey as he approached, a pulsing network of arteries, capillaries, marrow, and spinal fluid. As the Fanyaka neared her position, Misaki flicked her fingers, using the ice she had formed on one of the doors to slam it shut. Instinctively, the man whirled toward the sound, turning his back to her. Misaki peeled from the shadow and stabbed. There was a crunch, accompanied by a choking grunt of surprise, as Siridenya hit her mark. The Fanyaka didn't have to linger long in his pain. Darkness lent Misaki's attacks unparalleled precision. Without the distraction of clothes, skin, and other visible features, she could hit the exact internal part of a person she was aiming for. Unhindered by the bones that would have stopped a lesser sword, Siridenya had driven directly through the young man's heart. Misaki slid the blade free of the soldier's chest and felt his blood pour onto the floor as he fell. She stood still for a moment, absorbing sensation. She had always wondered what it would feel like to stab someone through the heart, but this was disappointing. She had assumed, for some reason, that killing a person would be hard. But it wasn't. When you were used to slicing tendons, of course cutting a man in half was easy. When you had trained to stab between major arteries, of course piercing a whole organ was easy. With a blade like Siridenya, killing was obviously going to be easier than not killing. She should have understood that, but she couldn't explain the emptiness that suddenly overwhelmed her. The line between wounding and taking a life had been such a concrete and non-negotiable thing to Robin and Aline. Yet Misaki had just crossed that line without experiencing so much as a tug of resistance. She had wanted there to be resistance. Deep in her heart, she had hoped there was something of Robin in her. The young man's blood spread from his body to seep between her bare toes, still eerily warm from a life that was no more. He had been someone's son. Why couldn't she feel anything? As a mother, a woman, a human, how could she feel nothing? Unbidden, her free hand lifted to touch her waist. How could she? A shuffle of movement from the hallway drew Misaki's attention. As her hand left her stomach to grip Shadow's daughter, she welcomed the emptiness. It didn't leave any room for fear as she went to face her next victims. 3 yellow-clad Fanyakala faced her in the front hall. And for the moment, Misaki let herself be thankful for the thing she was. After all, a lady wouldn't have been able to slice a man's legs out from under him and then plunge a blade into his mouth when he opened it to scream. A mother wouldn't have been able to cut a young woman's head from her shoulders. A human being wouldn't have been able to turn from their dismembered corpses without a single pang of guilt. Thank the gods she was a monster. The third soldier managed to catch Misaki in the arm with a burst of phonia, knocking Shadow's daughter from her hand. Back in Livingston, she had always had her daggers to fall back on if she was disarmed. But your greatest concealed weapons aren't really this or this, Coley had told her, holding up each of the knives in turn. They're your ingenuity and your brutality. Snatching one of the long pins from her hair, she darted toward the last Fanyaka. He threw a palm strike, but it was telegraphed. She evaded and drove her hairpin into the side of his neck, burying the hair ornament all the way up to the flowery bauble at the end. He choked, blood spattering from his mouth, and clawed at his throat. Not wanting him to suffer longer than necessary, Misaki jabbed a fingertip of concentrated Jia into one of his eyes. The blood needle pierced deep into his brain, killing him instantly. She let out a breath as the man's body crumpled to the floor. He twitched and then lay still, blood running from his neck and eye onto the flowers of Misaki's hairpin. Like all of Kotetsu Tamami's work, the ornament was a masterpiece, a sensitive composition of pearls and pink lacquer blossoms. Blood ran in between the petals, accentuating the beauty of all their details for a moment before consuming them in red. Misaki's hair, now free of its tightly pinned bun, stuck to her neck, and she realized just how sweaty she had gotten. In Livingston, disabling 7 enemies would have been a warm-up for her. Now, she was breathing as if she had just sprinted the length of a city. Trying to ignore the burning in her muscles and the growing stitch in her side, she picked her way through the corpses to retrieve Cyrodienia. She kept a wary eye on the broken-down doors as she swept the blood from the blade, but no more soldiers appeared. She had just set the top of Cyrodienia against her left knuckle to return the weapon to its sheath when the air stirred through her loose hair, making her stop. Phonia. Strong Phonia. She returned both hands to her sword handle as a pair of uniformed figures appeared in the doorway. Oh, Zero. Misaki's heart dropped. These soldiers wore black. Mamoru. Mamoru ran faster than he ever had in his life. He didn't have time to pick the easiest path up the snow-covered rocks, so he did what his father did, making ice steps for himself as he ran. In his haste to reach the blacksmith village, he nearly tripped and fell over a body that lay crumpled in his path. It was Katakuri Hakuzora, dead in the snow. On his way back to the old village, the archer must have heard the screams or seen the smoke and detoured to help the blacksmiths. His bow lay splintered beside him, his sightless eyes squinted slightly as if he had been lining up a shot when he died. There was no time to collapse and mourn. Mamoru had done enough of that over Yukino-sensei's body. In all likelihood, that was when the Fanyakala had broken through to the Numu village, while Mamoru had knelt crying like a child. Dropping briefly to one knee, Mamoru took Katakuri's hand and wrapped it around the grip of his bow where it belonged. "Naima to your soul, senpai," he murmured, and he was back on his feet, sprinting. As he neared the Numu village, Mamoru felt for the second time that day that his skin might peel, not from wind this time, but heat. He was used to the distant warmth of forges, the way it built as he neared the little village, but the fire-dried waves of air rushing over him were far hotter than they should have been. He leaped over the final ridge to the village and crashed into a wall of heat so intense it felt like it might knock him back down the slope. He had known from the oversized columns of smoke that something would be on fire, but nothing could have prepared him for the inferno that spread out before him now. For a moment, he could only stand transfixed and terrified as the smoke took his breath and the heat sucked the moisture from his skin. Fire is like an animal, Kotetsu Kama always told him. If you feed it, soothe it, and treat it with care, it need not bite you. The first few times the smith master had had him stoke a fire, Mamoru had accidentally put it out when his Jia jumped in response to the heat. "Easy, Koro," Kotetsu had snapped, smacking his hand back with a pair of tongs. "This isn't a fight. Do you understand?" "Yes, Kama." Mamoru rubbed his smarting knuckles, pulled the moisture from the kindling he had just doused, and picked up the striking stones to start again. But each time the flame swelled, Mamoru's Jia surged up against it out of reflex, like water rushing back to fill the space left by a stone when it was dropped in a pool. "What are you afraid of?" Kotetsu asked after Mamoru's 4th failed attempt. "I'm not," Mamoru started to protest. It was unseemly for a Koro to admit fear, but he stopped short at the knowing look on his mentor's face. "It's just, isn't fire what hell is made of?" "Not just fire. There are boiling seas in hell also," Kotetsu pointed out. "Oh, Mamoru hadn't thought of that." "I didn't. You misunderstand the order of the world. Hell is fire without the calming influence of Nagi and Nami. Fire without the power of gods to balance it." "And what is our Jia?" "The power of gods," Mamoru said. "I know you Corona like to frame relationships between opposites in terms of conflict," Kotetsu said, drawing a piece of glowing hot metal from the coals. "Fire against water, light against darkness, day against night, but one who hopes to create must understand that opposites exist to balance and complement one another. This is why the tide-bringing moon follows the drying sun, why day follows night, why men marry women. I believe this is why the 2 greatest empires are Yama, built on the power of fire, and our own Kaigen, built on the power of water. The 2 exist in this realm, not to destroy one another, but to create a balance between Jia and Teia." He paused to douse the red-hot metal with water. In this balance, there is creation. Steam hissed from the metal, dispersing to reveal the twisted serpents that would one day form the guard of Mamoru's sword. As a warrior endeavoring to draw on the Numu arts, it is vital that you understand this. What about Fonya? Mamoru asked, staring at the serpents, made of two different metals, but wound so tightly together. The Finnuas say that the Fanyukalu were born from this ocean, just like our ancestors. They were born from gods too. Kotetsu made a thoughtful noise. I believe that Fanyukalu, whatever divinity they hold, has been corrupted into a type of power that was never meant to be. Not in the realm of the Duna. I don't understand. Based on what I know of wind, what it does to fire and oceans and empires, I would say that Fonya is the power of chaos. Anyone who wields the power of wind, whether he realizes it or not, is a sort of demon. Mamoru had not understood his mentor's logic at the time. Fanyukalu controlled air, an essential part of water and fire. Kotetsu himself had taught Mamoru to use the bellows to ensure a fire was properly oxygenated. Every living human, including Jijakalu and Tajakalu, breathed air to survive. He had never understood how something so vital to all life in the realm of the Duna could be a force of hell. He understood now. The Fanyukala couldn't have reached this place more than a few Siarano ago, but the blacksmith village was already consumed. Even with the forges smashed to pieces, the fire never could have spread so fast or grown so furious without wind behind it. Mamoru had come to know fire as an animal that could be tamed with Jia, but this fire was uncontrolled, an animal fed to bursting, whipped to a rage, and set loose on its keepers. This was the power that had ravaged the order of the world, destabilized Yama's Namindiga colonies, ripped the Kaigenese Empire in two. This was the power of chaos. With a sickening feeling in his stomach, Mamoru remembered that Uncle Takashi had ordered the Numua to stay in their houses. He wondered how many of them had been able to outrun the flames, and of those, how many had escaped the Ranganese soldiers. He tried to run straight for the Kotetsu's house, but the moment he approached the nearest structure, the flames leaped at him like hungry demons, simultaneously lashing at his skin and evaporating his only means of defense. Pressing forward, he raised his Jia and threw snow into the fire in an attempt to clear a path through the flames. It was no use. Most of what he threw evaporated in an ineffectual hiss. The Matsuda dragon itself would have had its jaws full fighting this creature. Overwhelmed by the heat, Mamoru had no choice but to double back and go around the worst of the fire. The best he could do now was find any survivors and get them out. As he ran into a part of the village where the fire was less intense, a sound drew his attention. Crying. The sob broke off abruptly in a crunch of bone. He rounded a burning house to find a Ranganese soldier standing over a prone woman. Her face was so bloody that it took Mamoru a moment to recognize her as Kotetsu Saori, one of Kotetsu Kama's cousins. She was the one who did the lacquer work on the sheets. She had spent over a year designing his mother's sewing box, agonizing over each iridescent flower petal. The Fanyaka's boot was on her neck. Seemingly unaware of Mamoru's presence, he lifted his foot to stomp again. Mamoru had never formed and fired a spear so fast in his life. The water jumped into formation before his thoughts had even solidified into an attack, propelled forward by pure rage. The Fanyaka barely had a chance to lift his head before he was impaled through the chest. As the icy projectile jutted out of the soldier's back, Mamoru was already racing forward. Kotetsu-san. He fell to his knees beside the woman and touched her shoulder. Kotetsu-san, can you hear me? But the blood in her veins had slowed. Her Nyama didn't stir. She was gone. Her young daughter lay a bound away, her spine twisted at a horrible angle, broken. Further down the foot-beaten path through the center of the village were other bodies, big and small, men and women. Kotetsu Saori's oldest daughter, Kasumi, lay dead beside a tiny bundle of a body. Her newborn son. A baby. No older than little Izumo. A few Siarano ago, Mamoru hadn't thought there could be anything worse than staring down at his teacher's still fingers and shattered skull. But Yukino-sensei was a warrior. He had lived to fight. It was one thing to kill a Koro, who faced you with pride and purpose. But death in battle held no meaning for a Nomu. What had been done here was unthinkable. Unforgivable. Beside Mamoru, the Fanyaka jerked against the ground, coughing blood. Not quite dead. Rage flooded Mamoru, and he brought his sword slamming down on the man's exposed throat. The awkward angle and sloppy technique caused the blade to stick in the Fanyaka's spinal column. Mamoru jerked it free with a snarl and stood. For a moment, he felt an overwhelming urge to lift his own foot and stomp on the Fanyaka, feel his body break beneath his heel. Crush him. Break him until he was as shattered as the women and little children he had killed. But there were more Numiwu in this village, and if even one was still breathing, Mamoru had to protect them. Fists clenched, he stepped over the Fanyaka's corpse and moved on to look for survivors. He scanned every piece of wreckage as he went, but found no movement except the hellish thrashing of the flames. It seemed that whatever Ranganese had been here had moved on after ensuring that their victims were dead. Kotetsu Sari's killer must have been a straggler. Halfway through the village, Mamoru encountered a thick wall of ice. It was mostly melted, but it had succeeded in holding the flames back from the easternmost houses in the village. Mamoru let an open hand trail over the water-slick ice and felt relief wash over his singed nerves. He knew this ice, recognized its stable underlying structures. Rounding the end of the wall, he finally found human movement in the rubble. His face broke into a smile of relief when he recognized the soot-stained face of his mentor. Kotetsu-kama. His voice cracked. You're alive. The ice wall had prevented the fires from reaching the Kotetsu's wooden house, but the Fanyukala had decimated the structure, reducing it to a pile of rubble. Matsuda Dano. The blacksmith looked up as Mamoru ran to him. You have to help me. What is it? Mamoru asked. My son. Kotetsu's usually steady hands shook and Mamoru realized that they were smeared with blood from clawing through the rubble. Atsushi is trapped under the house. And the rest of the family? Mamoru asked. Kotetsu-kama swallowed. They. Mamoru had never heard Kotetsu struggle to control his voice. The little ones were able to crawl out and run after. He swallowed. After the soldiers were gone. I think they made it to safety. What about your wife? Mamoru asked. Your mother. Kotetsu shook his head. It was so fast. There were only a few of them, but they brought the fire out of the forges. Then when people came running out of the houses, they killed them. Ka-san knew. She told us not to stay inside from the beginning. He put a hand to his eyes. Mamoru had never seen his mentor this way, as a husband and son, as someone who could feel lost. Kotetsu-kama. Mamoru had no idea how he kept his own voice from trembling. You have to get out of here. There are still Ranganese coming up the mountain. Uncle Takashi said he would hold them, but I don't know how long I won't leave without my son. Mamoru found himself wanting to nod in agreement. Something in him didn't want Kotetsu to go. The Nomu had always been a source of comfort and guidance, but he was a blacksmith. It wasn't within his power to stop the threat coming up the mountain, nor was it his responsibility. It was Mamoru's. I will protect your son, Mamoru promised. But I need you out of danger. I'm just one fighter. I don't know if I can protect you both at once. Surely you're not on your own, Kotetsu said. The Yukinos and Mizumakis are all gone. My father was sent back to the main village to protect the women and children and my uncle. Mamoru couldn't understand how he suddenly knew. My uncle is dead, he said softly. What? The stricken look on Kotetsu's face reminded Mamoru that the blacksmith had once helped train a young Takashi at the forges. They had been friends since childhood. He can't be. Despite Kotetsu's denial, Mamoru knew. He still wasn't sure how. Maybe the certainty came through his subconscious awareness of the Nayama around him. Maybe it was the simple logic of how much blood Uncle Takashi had lost, how many enemies he had been facing, and how long it had been. The Ranganese will be here any dinma, he told Kotetsu with fresh urgency. You need to be gone before they get here. I'll take care of Atsushi. Go. But do what I say. Mamoru bellowed, surprised at the strength in his own voice. In the forge, he was Kotetsu's student, but the forges were gone now. This village had turned into a battlefield, and on the battlefield, the Koro's command ruled. Kotetsu only hesitated for a moment, considering Mamoru as though seeing him for the first time. "You're a fine Kuro, Matsuda Mamoru." He bowed his head in acceptance. "I leave my son to you." Mamoru nodded, silently accepting responsibility. "Nayama to you, Matsuda Dano," Kotetsu said, and fled up the mountain. Immediately, Mamoru got down on his hands and knees and peered into the darkness beneath the rubble. "Atsushi-kun," he called his friend. His voice shook at first, but he pushed the tremor down with a smile. "Atsushi-kun," his voice was stronger now, more encouraging. "Can you hear me?" He couldn't quite make out words, but there was a muffled response from under the broken wood and stone. Wind whipped the flames on the other side of Kotetsu's ice wall. The Fanyukala had almost reached them. "Hold on, okay? I'm going to get you out of there. I just need to take care of some Fanyukala first." "Hold on." Gripping his sword, Mamoru ran to the edge of the village, far from the flames, where he could meet his enemies with the full frozen power of his Jia. If there had been some small hope that his uncle would survive to help him, it disappeared when he reached the ridge overlooking the southern pass. He had always heard that a Theonite's Nayama could do strange things at the moment of death. He had felt the air spasm when he killed Fanyukalu, but the gruesome sight below was unlike anything he had ever heard of. It was as if every drop of Uncle Takashi's godlike Nayama had manifested in ice at the end, in some sort of final defiance. The resulting formation was not a recognizable shape like a katana or a dragon. It was something primal and raw. An explosive personality in life, Matsuda Takashi had become an explosion in death, frozen branches and blades bursting from his body in all directions, crystal ice veined with blood. Unwary Fanyukala who had been too slow to jump clear were speared through limbs, chests, and abdomens by the force of his dying Jia. Some had been hoisted off their feet high into the air, creating a tree of corpses that glittered red against the sunset. Those who had survived the carnage were charging up the slope toward Mamoru. With a slow breath, Mamoru raised his sword. Atsushi and Kotetsu Kama were behind him, counting on him to protect them. Beyond them, his mother and father were counting on him. Beyond this mountain, the fishermen of the Shirajima Islands and the farmers of Yue and Hakudeo were counting on him. His empire was counting on him. He took in his enemies 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 Fanyukalu as they flew up the slope. Any one of these soldiers who got past this point would kill Kotetsu Kama on the path. They would kill Atsushi too, if they found him, and then move on to the main village to kill more. And after that, after everyone in Takayubi was dead, these soldiers would press inland, bringing the same fate to hundreds more. Unless the Sword of Kaigen served its purpose. So I will. With that thought, Mamoru's limbs seemed to grow light, buoyed by new energy. Yukino-sensei had given his life so he could fight on, and Uncle Takashi had given his last moments to make the job easier. Their strength was in his limbs, pumping from his heart into his veins. There were no longer any confusing ambiguities or difficult choices. There was only what Mamoru had been bred and trained for since he was old enough to hold a practice sword, to charge down the mountain at his enemies and kill. 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 Chapter 16. The Soul. For the second time that day, Misaki shrank away from the Ranganese at her doorstep, but this time her fear was not pretend. Even at her physical prime, she wouldn't have dreamed of challenging a member of Ranga's special forces in combat. Now she faced two. The taller of the pair was a towering man with a spray of shrapnel scars across half his face, a sign that he had survived battles in the past. The smaller was a woman with the sort of legs Misaki would have killed for when she was at daybreak, long and well-built. At first glance, neither Funyaka had any weapons, but Misaki noticed that the woman had a pair of strange straight knives tucked into her belt, one at each hip. No, not knives, Misaki realized. Fans. Misaki had once made fun of Yuli for fighting with a folding fan, but she had shut up after she saw the way a deftly wielded fan could amplify phonia, doubling its range and power. To a Jijaka, a fan was an aristocrat's accessory to go with fine inkstones and scented stationery. To a skilled Fanyaka, it was the difference between a strong attack and a devastating one. The black-clad Ranganese stepped forward and Misaki stepped back. Just from the phonia radiating from them and the powerful grace of their movements, she knew that facing them in combat was not an option. The only thing she could do was try to draw them away from the cellar where her family sheltered. Turning, Misaki ducked into the nearest side hallway. The female Fanyaka darted after her, gaining on her with alarming speed. Damn those legs. The male Fanyaka smashed right through a wall to cut off her retreat. Misaki stumbled to a stop, her heart pounding, trapped between two fighters far stronger than herself. The man took a menacing step toward her while the woman drew the fans from her belt. Thinking fast, Misaki drew all the water she could from the surrounding air. She raised the liquid on either side of her, as if ready to form twin ice shields, as if she had anywhere near the power of Jia to withstand what they would throw at her. The female Fanyaka let out a derisive huff of laughter. One of the fans flipped open and struck. Instead of bracing her defenses, Misaki let go of them. As the water dropped, so did she, flattening herself against the floor. There had been a time she could drop into a full split cold. Now just a low crouch strained her muscles and sent a burning pop of pain through her hip, but it effectively put her below the trajectory of the air pressure. The male Fanyaka probably would have been able to dodge his comrade's attack in an open fight, but Misaki's water had obscured his view of the fan wielder until it was too late. The wave of amplified phonia slammed into his body at full force, knocking him through the nearest wall and, judging by the crashing sounds, probably the two behind it as well. Aya dash! The female Fanyaka uttered a gasp of alarm. Misaki's impulse was to use her enemy's moment of surprise and distress to close the distance between them, but a twinge of pain in her hip told her that wasn't going to be possible. Instead, she slung a whip of ice-laced water at the woman's ankles. Too slow. The Fanyaka was light on her feet and leaped over the arc of the attack. The wind-enhanced jump sent her spinning through the air toward Misaki. One of those long legs swung toward the ceiling and then dropped, heel first, like a hammer. Misaki's days of springing around with that kind of elastic agility were past. She had to clumsily throw herself to the side to avoid the attack. The axe kick landed with terrifying force, splintering wood and shaking the whole house. If the woman's foot hadn't broken clean through the floorboards, Misaki probably would not have survived the next two Denmanu. The moment the woman took to extract her leg from the planks gave Misaki time to scramble into a ready stance. Even so, she just barely managed to dodge the following slash. Fan blades clipped her sleeve, tearing the blue fabric. As the Fanyaka swung through her missed attack, Misaki turned her body into an upward cut, aiming for the brachial artery under the woman's extended arm. But rather than trying to reset, the woman spun with the momentum of her missed attack. Her body turned before the blade reached it, removing Misaki's target. Misaki's cut brushed the back of the elite's uniform without hitting flesh, but that was the beauty of a little sword like Siridenia. She could change directions on a nay. The moment Misaki's cut missed, she flipped her sword over for an overhand slice to her opponent's neck. As the woman completed her spin, a closed fan clanged into the side of Siridenia, knocking it off course. Misaki pulled Shadow's daughter back to her hip as the Fanyaka did the same with her closed fan. In a strangely mirror-like moment, both women launched off a back foot, going for the stab. Stupid girl, Misaki thought, almost disappointed with her young opponent. The Fanyaka might have speed and strength on her side, but it wouldn't matter. Siridenia's stabbing range was so much longer than that of a fan, there was no way the Ranganese woman's attack could land first. Siridenia drove toward her victim's chest, aimed past the black-buttoned uniform, past the breast to the beating heart beneath. But in her haste to end the fight, Misaki had forgotten about the other fan. It appeared in the way just before her blade could strike its mark. Siridenia, of course, passed through the thin metal, but the stab had been diverted, missing the woman's heart to tear harmlessly through her sleeve. Misaki made to slice free, but before she could adjust her stance to do so, the fan snapped closed, trapping the Zilazan glass blade in its folds. Gripping the closed fan, the woman twisted the sword from Misaki's hands, sending both weapons spinning away. The moment she realized she was being disarmed, Misaki relinquished her hold on the sword and changed her stance to aim blood needle-ready fingers at the woman's neck. Even with the opening, she still wasn't fast enough. The Fanyaka bent out of the way of the attack, effortlessly drawing Misaki into a joint lock. Against a stiffer fighter, Misaki would have tried to relax her muscles and slide free, but this woman was so flexible, she might as well have tried to escape the coils of a python. In a heartbeat, Misaki found herself slammed against the wood floor, her arm twisted painfully behind her, a knee crushing down between her shoulder blades. 15 years ago, she would have bladed ice across the bottom of her foot and snapped a scorpion kick into the woman's face, but she knew without trying that she no longer had the flexibility in her spine to make a move like that work. The woman twisted her weight against Misaki's arm, wrenching a roar of pain from Misaki's throat. Think, Misaki. Think, before your arm is broken. This Fanyaka was sharp. She would notice any overt movement in either Misaki's body or the surrounding water. Thankfully, the Tsusano blood needle was not the only needle in Misaki's arsenal. With 2 fingers, she drew together a sliver of water molecules astride from herself and the Fanyaka, a tiny version of the mighty ice spears the men of Takayubi were so fond of. Most fighters would choose a forbidding spear over a needle, but the nice thing about needles was that they could slide through cloth, flesh, or air unnoticed, and they took only a tiny movement to direct. The Ranganese woman didn't notice anything as Misaki's water thread froze to a hard point. She cranked Misaki's arm further. As the pain spiked, Misaki snapped her 2 fingers inward, yanking the ice needle toward them. The shriek was as gratifying as it was terrible. It let Misaki know that her attack had found its mark in the Fanyaka's eye. As that snake-like grip released, Misaki rolled free and staggered to her feet. Impressively, the Fanyaka found her way to her feet as well, a hand over her bleeding eye. Her scream of pain rising to one of rage, she lunged for Misaki. The remaining fan flashed forward, and had the woman's depth perception not been compromised, Misaki would have been sliced to pieces in the ensuing fit of slashing and screaming. As it was, she had to deflect a few of the attacks with her forearms, shredding her sleeves and splattering her blood across the floor. The woman drove her out of the hall, into the kitchen, and Misaki knew she had to end this, while the advantage was still hers. Her eyes started to where she and Setsuko kept the knives, but her brain canceled the thought before she risked her neck trying to go for the cupboard. She hadn't been able to kill this woman with a Zilizan-glass sword. What good was a little kitchen knife going to do? Even injured, this woman moved so much faster than she did. She would have to immobilize her to kill her. Misaki was at the end of her stamina, her overtaxed legs ready to buckle beneath her, while the Fanyaka's fury seemed to be making her stronger by the Dinma. Stumbling back from her crazed enemy, Misaki fell against the counter, careful to place herself directly in front of the sink. The woman swung her fan, releasing a burst of fonya, and Misaki dove sideways, letting the air pressure slam into the sink. Water exploded through the room, pouring from the broken faucet onto the floor and spraying high into the air. The Fanyaka let out a cry of surprise as the spray caught her in her good eye. Misaki took advantage of the woman's moment of blindness and moved in. Not trusting her shaking muscles with a sweep kick or any of the more advanced takedowns in her repertoire, she launched her whole body forward in a tackle. The taller fighter was so well-muscled that it felt like ramming her shoulder into solid rock, but Misaki's momentum managed to take her off her feet. Both women crashed to the floor as water spread out beneath them and rained from above. Instead of trying to pin the stronger woman down with her weight, Misaki landed with her palms on either side of her victim and forced her exhausted Jia into motion. As the Fanyaka's good eye snapped open, her grip tightened on her fan and her fonya swirled back into motion with a vengeance, but it was too late. The fight was over. The same clinging ice Misaki once used to scale walls was also excellent for immobilizing an opponent. Where most Jijakalu required a considerable amount of water to freeze someone's body in place, Misaki needed only a thin sheet. In the moment after they hit the wet floor, She had frozen the Fanyaka's hair, skin, and uniform to the floorboards with ice strong enough to stick a human to the side of a skyscraper. Misaki watched the woman's working eye widen as she registered the biting cold and realized that she couldn't move. Her face twisted into a snarl. Fonia whipped Misaki's hair and kimono, but without its wielder's limbs to give it direction, the wind was no more than impotent bluster. Reaching to the woman's right hand, Misaki pried the fan from her fingers. It might be a messy instrument of execution, but her muscles and Gia were so exhausted that she didn't think she had it in her to form an ice spear or even stand up and search for Siridenya. Flipping the fan open, she tried to find a comfortable grip on the base with her left hand. Her right arm had been twisted so hard, she didn't trust it to hold a weapon. "You slimy Kaigenese sea slug," the woman spat, resorting to racist insults, as so many fighters did in defeat. Not good ones either. "You cheated." Indignant, Misaki scowled down at the Fanyaka. "You try fighting fair after pushing out 4 babies," she panted in Shirajima dialect she knew the woman couldn't understand. As soon as the words were out of her mouth, a thought made her pause and stare down at the Fanyaka. She was certainly younger than Misaki, but not too young to have children of her own. She had stopped struggling. Instead, she lay under Misaki, still except for the rise and fall of her chest. Her jaw was set in determination. It was the look of a woman steeling herself for death, the look of a woman who knew, who had always known, what she was getting into. If she had children, well, then she shouldn't have traveled over the ocean to kill someone else's. She had no one to blame but herself. Misaki raised the fan to strike. "You're holding it wrong." The unexpected words only made Misaki pause for a denma. It was a mistake. In that moment of hesitation, the woman moved. An animalistic shriek rent the air as her right arm ripped free of the ice, leaving her sleeve and most of her skin behind. In a lurch of horror, Misaki realized that the woman hadn't been steeling herself for death, but for the worst pain imaginable. Roaring in agony, the Fanyaka caught Misaki's face in an iron grip, fingers slick with blood. Misaki tried to jerk her head back, but the younger woman was too strong. Powerful fingers dug in, levering her jaw open, and the Fanyaka pulled not on Misaki's body, but the air inside it. Breath rushed from Misaki's lungs, dizzying her, and a sharp pain drove through her chest like knives. Panic took hold as she realized what was happening to her. Laza Linghun, the Ranganese called it, the soul pull, a bloodline technique as rare as the whispering blade and as feared as blood puppeteering. It took a tremendous amount of power to vacuum the air from another Theonite's body, but with enough training, there were members of certain bloodlines who could do it. And in her pain-spiked rage, power did not seem to be an issue for this woman. Misaki tried to fight the pull, tried to expand her lungs in a deep breath, but the moment she did, the rib-splitting pain nearly made her faint. In Dimanu, her lungs would be sucked empty, reduced to crumpled tissue. Unable to claw the stronger Theonite's hand from her face, she slashed the bladed fan across the woman's throat. Blood spurted from the Fanyaka's neck, and her body convulsed against its ice prison. Horrifyingly, her death throes only caused her grip to tighten, her nails drawing blood from Misaki's cheeks, and the pull intensified. It was as if the Fanyaka's soul itself had dug claws into Misaki on its way out of the living world, determined to drag her with it. Pain splintered through Misaki's chest and sides as her lungs started to collapse. Blind with panic, she struck again, driving the fan so deep into the woman's neck that it hit her spine and stuck there. The Fanyaka's hand stiffened around Misaki's face, twitched, then finally slid away. Too late, Misaki thought as the world blurred. Too late. Her aching jaw opened wide, but no air came. Only suffocating darkness. Mamoru. Mamoru made such quick work of the 5 Fanyakalu that it didn't seem real. Was this what it was like to be Uncle Takashi? He wondered as he whirled, cutting through 2 yellow-clad soldiers in the same slash. If this was how good it felt, then he supposed he was happy his uncle had died fighting. The bodies hit the snow and lay still. Mamoru stood among them, shoulders back, breathing hard in a mixture of exertion and exhilaration. After confirming that there were no more Fanyakalu advancing up the slope, he ran to the Kotetsu's house and started digging through the rubble. Reaching out with his Jia, it didn't take him long to find Atsushi. "Mamo, Matsuda Dano," the boy's voice broke in relief. Atsushi had always been quick with his Jia for a Numa, and it had saved his life. He had braced the debris off of his body with a pair of thick ice pillars. He didn't have the strength to push it off him entirely, but Mamoru did. "Atsushi-kun. On 3, we're going to lift together. Ichi and I, San." Their combined Jia shoved the debris upward and Atsushi scrambled out from underneath. Mamoru grabbed his hand and pulled him to safety. Before he let the load back down, Mamoru stuck his arm underneath the house one last time, extending his fingers, feeling for the pulse of living blood. If Atsushi had survived the collapse, maybe someone else had too. Maybe, but no pulses pulled at Mamoru's fingertips. Only a slow, iron-laden ooze he was coming to recognize as blood leaving a corpse. Closing his eyes, he withdrew his arm and released his Jia, letting what remained of the house crash down. Atsushi was clinging to his sleeve, shaking. Mamoru, the little blacksmith, gasped, forgetting formality in a mixture of anger and hysteria. "My mother is still under there. My grandmother, listen to me, Atsushi-kun." Mamoru held the boy firmly by the shoulders. "Your mother is," the words caught in his throat. He couldn't say it. He couldn't imagine hearing those words, so he chose different ones. "All your mother would want is for you to live." And that was worse, because he didn't have to imagine. He had seen the look on Ka-chan's face when he pulled himself from her hands, watched her fingers grasp at the air where he had been. That's all she would want. Your grandmother too. You know that. Atsushi was shaking his head in denial, his eyes shining with tears. And, perhaps because he suddenly felt tears threatening in his own eyes, Mamoru slid an arm around Atsushi and pressed the little blacksmith to his shoulder. "For your mother, Atsushi-kun. Head up the mountain. Catch up with your father if you can. If you can't, find a safe place to take shelter. You know this mountain better than the Fanyakalu. If you hide..." Mamoru trailed off as something caught his attention, a flash of black on the rocks above, too fast to be a passing bird. His heart dropped. "Run, Atsushi-kun." "What run?" Mamoru threw the boy from him. He had barely flung his own body backward when the phonia hit. The wave of air pressure struck the snow where he and Atsushi had been with a sound more like thunder than wind. Mamoru tucked into a ball and rolled as he hit the ground. When he uncurled onto his feet, Tabi skidding through the snow, Atsushi was still tumbling from the force of the attack. The wind had thrown the two of them several bounds apart. The elite Fanyaka landed in a crouch between them, torn black cloth fluttering about him like feathers before settling about his form. Mamoru hadn't gotten a close look at the man's face before, but his eyes passing slowly over the man's body confirmed his worst fear. There was the sloppily retied braid cut by Yukino-sensei's first swing. There were the thin cuts where the Matsuda dragon's teeth had sliced through his clothes into his skin. There was the bleeding puncture wound in his left shoulder where Tusama had aimed to kill him and failed. The dragon killer uncurled into a standing position with lazy grace. On the other side of the Fanyaka, far beyond Mamoru's reach or the range of his Jia, Atsushi struggled to his knees. The 10-year-old Numu was shaken and disoriented. Easy prey. Helpless, Mamoru watched the dragon killer's eyes flick from him to Atsushi in playful indecision, as if he hadn't quite chosen a victim yet. If his injuries had weakened him, it didn't show in his posture, and if he was still at full strength, Mamoru knew that there was nothing he could do to protect his friend. "Run, Atsushi!" he shouted as Atsushi tried to stand. "Run!" Atsushi was fast for a Numu. Of course, that wouldn't save him from this demon who seemed to move at the speed of sound. "If I run," Mamoru thought frantically, "if Atsushi and I break in opposite directions, maybe I can get the Fanyaka to follow me." Running would cost him his life, he knew. You couldn't expose your back to a superior fighter and expect to live, but that wasn't the point. Mamoru was fast. He might be able to buy Atsushi enough time to get to safety. Then he remembered his first encounter with the dragon killer, remembered how the black-clad demon had brushed right past him and the Yukino cousins, heading straight for Yukino-sensei. This Fanyaka was like Uncle Takashi. He had a hunger for a good fight that eclipsed everything else. Where lesser predators were drawn to the weak and wounded, this one was drawn to strength. The realization snapped into place right as Atsushi found his feet and ran. Like a tiger triggered to motion by scattering deer, the Fanyaka darted after him. No! Panic lent speed to Mamoru's Jia as he raised the snow and fired a pair of spears at the Fanyaka. The dragon killer must not have been sufficiently impressed because he blew Mamoru's attacks away without so much as a glance in his direction and took another step after Atsushi. No! The power of a dozen Jijakalu seemed to fill Mamoru's limbs. The ice wall was bigger than anything he had ever formed in one shot. It exploded from the snow like a geyser and rose to tower over the dragon killer, stopping him in his tracks. Mamoru was well aware that the Fanyaka could break through the wall or vault over the top if he really wanted to. It was a simple show of power, something to draw the man's attention from Atsushi. It worked. The Fanyaka turned to Mamoru as if seeing him for the first time. He wore a strange expression, as if he hadn't decided if he was impressed or just exasperated. If you even think about following him, I'll fill your back with spears. Mamoru knew the Fanyaka didn't speak Shirajima dialect, but he was certain that the threat carried in his tone. The dragon killer raised an eyebrow as if to say, "Are you serious? You're sure you don't want to run?" I wasn't made to run, Mamoru thought. Face me, Fanyaka. Realistically, Mamoru wasn't a match for this man, who had fought Yukino-sensei, Tusama, and Uncle Takashi to a standstill. But that was exactly why he had to win. There was no one further up the mountain who would be able to stop this creature. Dozens, possibly hundreds, of innocent people would die if he was allowed to continue on his way. Maybe I can't kill him, Mamoru thought, drawing his sword. Maybe I can't kill him, but I can do something. I can wound him badly enough that my parents will have no trouble finishing him off. How? The Fanyaka rolled his neck with a resigned sigh that seemed to say, let's get this over with quickly. Mamoru bent his knees, ready to spring out of the way of one of the long-range attacks these Fanyakala seemed to favor. Then he remembered how hungrily this particular Fanyaka had devoured the distance between himself and Yukino-sensei, not once but twice. His weapons, before he had lost one in Yukino-sensei's shoulder and the other in the maw of the Matsuda dragon, had been a pair of daggers, which worked best in a direct physical clash. For whatever reason, this man preferred fighting in close. But that didn't mean he couldn't fire off longer-range attacks. Mamoru had to be ready for an attack at any distance. The Fanyaka came at him, shooting over the open snow so fast his feet didn't even seem to touch the ground. More arrow than man. Mamoru's first instinct was to coil back into his stance and look for the perfect place to strike, like Tusama. End the fight in one cut, like Yukino-sensei. But Tusama and Yukino-sensei had already failed to kill this man, and Mamoru was not their equal. There was no precision or intelligence in Mamoru that this man hadn't already seen from Tusama, no speed or perfection of technique he hadn't seen from Yukino-sensei, no raw ferocity he hadn't seen from Uncle Takashi. Eyes forward, Ka-chan's voice reminded him, quelling his panic. Focus on what's ahead of you. Mamoru breathed out and Yukino-sensei's voice joined hers. A student like you, who can absorb what he is told but also think beyond it, is capable of anything. Mamoru's only chance, if he stood any chance at all, was to be that student and hit this man with something he wouldn't expect. So, instead of setting a stance to wait for Fanyaka, Mamoru ran to meet him. Unlike the other elite soldiers Mamoru had faced, the dragon killer didn't need to plant his feet to throw an attack. He fired off a palm strike mid-sprint. The lightning-quick blast didn't land with enough force to throw Mamoru off his feet or shatter bone, but the moment it hit, Mamoru realized its intended purpose too late. The wind had already struck his right arm, sending his katana spinning from his hand, high into the air. Losing his sword should have thrown him off, but he had built up too much momentum to let anything slow him down. He was a Matsuda. His sword wasn't made of ice or metal. It was his soul. Mist and snow rushed to his hands as the last of the distance between himself and his enemy collapsed. The Fanyaka's next palm strike hit the best impromptu ice shield Mamoru had ever formed. The shield's hardened outer layer shattered, while the snow cushion beneath absorbed the impact, blunting the force of the palm strike before it reached the innermost ice sheet that protected Mamoru's arms. The techniques canceled each other out, causing both fighters to stumble back only a few steps instead of sending them both flying. Regaining his footing, Mamoru threw what remained of his shield at the Fanyaka. In the Dinma the black-clad man took to swat the inner layer of the shield aside. Mamoru raised his hands and locked his Jia into the still airborne pieces of the outer layer. The ice had broken along plan seams, creating sharp-edged shards. "Let's see you dodge this," Mamoru thought, and yanked his hands inward, bringing those hundreds of sharp pieces racing toward the Fanyaka. Even the most agile fighter couldn't dodge his way through a hail of projectiles this thick. At the glint of approaching ice, the Fanyaka let out a short sound of surprise. Then he spun. Damn. Mamoru had forgotten he could do that. The rotation created a protective whirlwind around the Fanyaka. The cyclone wrapped around him like a cocoon, catching Mamoru's hundreds of tiny projectiles and flinging them away. Some of the ice shards flew wide. Most of them, however, shot straight toward Mamoru, propelled by a deadly combination of his own Jia and his enemy's Phonia. He had to push sharply outward with his Jia to avoid getting hit by his own projectiles. His reflexes saved him from fatal injury, though some of the ice struck him in the shoulders and thighs. His opponent didn't leave him time for the pain to set in. The Fanyaka's pivoting feet were as subtle as they were quick. Mamoru wouldn't have picked up the movement with his eyes alone, but he was so attuned to the water around him at that moment that he felt the shift in the snow beneath the soldier's boots. Even knowing the spinning kick was coming and having seen it in action, Mamoru barely managed to drop into a crouch in time to avoid it. He let out a breath of relief as the kick whooshed over his head, missing him completely. What he hadn't counted on was the second kick. He registered the black boot snapping toward his head too late to evade. All he could do was bring an arm up to protect his head. The roundhouse crashed into his forearm, which then crashed into his face, throwing him sideways. His head rang as if it had taken a full-force kick, and his arm. He was fairly sure something in his arm had broken. But oddly, it didn't hurt. Flooded with fighter's madness, he was far past feeling any pain. He spun out of the blow smiling, his fists up, ice sharpening across his knuckles. The fighter's high must have lent him speed because he managed to deflect the snake-like hand technique the Fanyaka aimed at his neck. He feinted a punch at the Fanyaka's face with one hand, using the other to target the man's injured shoulder. If Tusama had already done half the damage for him, maybe, the dragon killer saw through it. He barely bothered to dodge the feint, letting the weak blow clip his cheek, and parried the stronger punch Mamoru aimed at his shoulder. Sensing the Fanyaka shifting back, Mamoru seized a handful of the man's black uniform. He couldn't let the dragon killer out of close range. He had seen the kind of attack this man could throw from his optimal striking distance, and had no intention of letting him set up another one. Mamoru yanked the man forward. The dragon killer didn't seem to mind, drawing his arm back to throw a punch, a bizarrely telegraphed move for such an apt fighter. Mamoru brought his right hand up to block, but somehow, inexplicably, the Fanyaka's punch passed through it. The blow caught Mamoru in the stomach, bringing the world to an abrupt halt. A dull throb pulsed through his abdomen as a smile twisted the corner of the dragon killer's mouth. "Got you," he said in broken Kaijengwa. For a moment, Mamoru was so surprised to hear words he understood, coming out of the demon's mouth that all he could do was blink. Then he felt the blood soaking into his hakama, and it dawned on him that the attack he had just taken hadn't been a punch at all. Shock melted into dread as he looked down. The thumb and first two fingers of his sword hand were gone, sliced off at the second knuckles. There was a blade lodged beneath his ribs, long, bright, and strangely familiar. Mamoru couldn't understand where the weapon had come from until his eyes fell on teal wrapping and serpent's coils. It was his sword. The dragon killer had caught it on its way down. Mamoru's mind stuttered, confusion, denial, and begrudging are grinding against one another like wedges of ice on a breaking river. His own sword. Did that mean the Fanyaka had planned this whole exchange of blows? From the moment he knocked the weapon from Mamoru's hand? Was he really that good? If so, Mamoru had never stood a chance. Then again, maybe the wound wasn't as deep as it looked. Maybe he could still fight. He could still. The dragon killer ripped the blade free and Mamoru watched his own insides spill from his body. Reality overcame him like river waters breaking through the last of winter's ice. I'm dead, he realized with chilling clarity. I'm dead.